We are Charlotte's great university. Come see what's great only at Charlotte.
Well, good afternoon. I am Dolly King, Interim Dean of Bell College of Business. I'm so happy to welcome all of you here for the North Carolina Economic Forecast. It is so wonderful to connect with business community, our alum, our students, our faculty, both in person and also online. And thanks to our sponsor, Dubois Center, and also the School of Professional Studies. The Dubois Center at UNC Charlotte brings the university intellectual resources to the heart of Charlotte. It's a place where you can work on your graduate degree to build your network and also working on your continuing education. It is a perfect venue for meetings, seminars, workshops, receptions, and more. The UNC Charlotte School of Professional Study here also housed here and offer more than 200 programs for today's working adults. If this is your first economic forecast, welcome. And I know some of you have been here before. If you haven't visited us before, the Dubois Center is also the home base for our Bell College graduate program. We offer a variety of different part-time programs, including our nationally ranked Charlotte MBA that feature both in-person and online options. Now to our presentation. I know we're all waiting for that. We will have a question and answer session following the presentation. And so if you're joining us online, please submit your question via Zoom chat, and we will collect them and answer them, or John will answer them during the Q&A session. Now it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. John Connaughton, Professor of Economics. For over 40 years, John has been interpreting the data and sharing his expertise with us on North Carolina economy and where it has been and where it's going to go next. So we're all very excited. So please join me and welcome Dr. John Connaughton.
Dolly? Yes. Hopefully. All right. I guess I got turned on. Thanks, Dolly. Appreciate it. Well, good afternoon, everybody. And this is our second quarter outlook for the North Carolina economy. And as you probably know, there's a lot to talk about. So let's get with the program here. We don't need to worry about that. And so first thing we're going to talk about is a sort of a 2023 economic review. We're looking at 2023 GDP and employment. Then we're going to look at 40 years of economic change. I don't know if you noticed the first slide. We started this in 1982, and you would not believe how much the economy has changed in this state in that 40 plus year period. Will inflation return? I think that's everybody's mind these days. Economic headwinds and the Fed resolve. And then finally, we'll take a look at 2024. So this is kind of how we started the last year, or kind of how the last year went. It was kind of a rocky year. Started off really well. The middle of the year was kind of slow, as you can see, dropped down to 1.1%. But we had pretty strong third and fourth quarters with 4.6 and 3.8% for an overall increase year over year. So that's like July to July on average of 2.7%. And that's a pretty good growth rate these days. If you look at the forecast for the U.S. economy, the CBO is plugging 1.9, maybe 2% in some years over the next 10 years. So 2.7% is pretty good. And it's partly because we're growing as a state, and that's what's helping us continue to push out GDP increases that are greater than what we see in the U.S. For those of you that are new, this is a kind of a complicated chart, but what we do is we try to take a look at the sectors that contributed to the growth. And there are two pieces of information on this chart. So if the horizontal axis, which is listed here by the sectors, tells us the growth rate for the year of the different sectors. And over here, what we have on this axis here is essentially a pie chart. If you add up these numbers, it's 100%. So this dimension is giving you the percentage of total output that the sector provides to the overall economy. So if you look here at finance, insurance, and real estate, you see it's almost 20% of the state's economy. So that's a pretty big contributor. What this chart enables us to do is kind of look at the size, the area of these boxes, to see which of the sectors were contributing most to the overall growth. The bigger the box, the more that contributed to the overall growth of the sector. Of the economy. And you can see here that some of the big boxes were business and professional services, information, and retail trade. Those are the ones, and also educational health services. So you take those four boxes alone and you start to see where the growth of the economy has been coming from during 2023. This is the same type of thing for jobs, and you can see here that we're looking at employment growth in 23 of 1.8%. And again, you see where the sectors are. And again, it's similar sectors, not so much, finance, insurance, and real estate, which is this one here. But we see educational health services, hospitality and leisure services, and government were some of the sectors that provided most of the employment growth this year. A lot of sectors we see actually showed us negative growth in employment. We lost jobs in those sectors. So I mentioned earlier that we've been doing this since 1982, and I thought it might be nice to take a look at how the economy has changed. So this is a couple of pie charts, and there's a lot of color and a lot of things going on, but I want you to take a look. This is output in 1982, GDP essentially, pie chart, percentage each sector contributed to the overall GDP, and this is in 2023. Two things to take a look at here. This is durable goods manufacturing. This is non-durable goods manufacturing. If I add those two numbers together, I get 33.5%, which basically means a third of the economy of North Carolina in 1982 came from, third of the output came from the manufacturing sector. And if you look over here, services were 10.7% of output, and finance, insurance, and real estate were 11.8%. We come over here and all of a sudden look at the durables and non-durables. They dropped from 35 to, was that 14%? Okay. Pretty big decrease in terms of the importance of total output from in the state that these two sectors contributed. On the other hand, if we take a look here at finance, insurance, and real estate, it went from 11.8% to 19.9% of the state's output. And if we look at services, because of the new North American Industrial Classification Code system that was put in place since this is back in the old SIC stuff, we now break services out, not in one sector, but in a bunch of sectors. When you add them all up, it's now 29% of output versus 10% of output. So it's more than doubled. Okay, it's almost tripled in terms of its importance to overall output. That's a significant change. The same thing has happened with employment. Manufacturing was about a little over 33%, about a third of the jobs are in manufacturing. And today, less than 10% of the jobs are in manufacturing. When we look at services, back in 82, about 15% of the jobs there. It's 44% of the jobs in this state are in the service sector. That is absolutely phenomenal. And that is 40 years. That is a significant change. So I just thought that might be interesting to everybody to take a look at how much the state's economy has changed since we started doing this project a few years ago. All right, 3 years of inflation. How you feel about that? Everybody good? All right. So I just want to remind everybody, this is kind of a look back on history, because a lot of people that are in the process or in making decisions today about inflation and what's causing it and talking about it didn't live through the 70s. And as you can see here, the 70s, the federal funds rate is in blue, the CPI is in red. And you can see that here we're just tracking along, the two of them together. Every time that the CPI would start to peak out and go down, it dropped the federal funds rate, and that would just create another cycle. We had, as you can see, we had 1-2 peaks of well over 10% inflation during that 10-year period. Okay. This is an interesting chart. Okay. We go back to January of 91, and no particular reason, but, basically I wanted to take a look at this 30-year period. And during that period, you can see we had some fluctuations, and we saw it back in 91, it was high as 5.7%. And just before the Great Recession, it got up to 5.6% in terms of year-over-year inflation on a monthly basis. But on average, between January of 91 and January of 2021, when this all started to begin in terms of inflation, it averaged about 2.4%. So the Fed wasn't doing a bad job on average of hitting its target, if you will, of 2%. All right. And here's since January of 21, and you can see here, the blue line is the overall CPI. The red line is the core CPI, which is the CPI less food and energy. And then the gray line is the federal funds rate. And you can see here that as inflation was going and the Treasury and the Fed were saying, oh, it's just transitory. Don't worry about it. We got this, no problem. And as you can see, by the time they started to raise rates in 22, it had already peaked. And that's June of 22 when it peaked at 9.1% year over year. All right. And now we've seen both the overall rate and the core rate come down. Overall rate for last month was 3.4%. The core rate was 3.6%. The thing that I'm concerned about here is this is starting to look pretty sticky. And that's something that should be a problem going forward. It makes the Fed's job a lot more difficult in terms of trying to create this so-called soft landing that we've been hearing about. As far as how it has affected consumers, overall, since this all began in January of 21, we've seen prices rise essentially 20%. So what you used to get for 80 cents, now you get for $1. That's basically how to think about it. But wages have only increased 16.1%. So if you do the math on that, you're down almost 4%, 3.8% in terms of your purchasing power on average. Now, I know some folks have done better during that period of time. Some have done a lot worse. But on average, you're down just about 4% in purchasing power over the last 3 years. Here's kind of a history of the Fed's interest rate decisions. This is when they showed up kind of late to the game in 2022 after inflation had been going on for over a year. And they started raising rates, and then they got pretty aggressive with them when they started to see that 9% rate. So this is the June number, this 75 basis point increase in federal funds rate. And as you can see, the last 6 meetings, they have essentially done zero. They've not changed it. It sits now between 5.25% and 5.5%. Okay, fighting the Fed and types of inflation. All right, there are 3 causes of inflation: demand pull. That's a simple one. Too much money chasing too few goods. Cost push. That's when costs are rising, particularly of resources and commodities rising, causing the cost of production to go up and therefore having to be passed on. And then inflationary expectations. And quite frankly, that's the worst one of all, because that's essentially people and businesses assuming that prices go up. They expect them to go up. And therefore, on one hand, they're more likely to raise prices just to see how it goes. Number 2, consumers are more likely to accept those prices and says, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to buy your product now that the price has gone up. Or what I've seen recently is how many people have seen shrinkflation? I went to buy some, Cracker Barrel cheese slices, and I was like, that's not right. And it's like 2 ounces less you get now for the same price, but I guess that's shrinkflation, right? So, but I bought it, so I'm part of the problem. Inflationary expectations, okay? So that's a problem. So who's fighting the Fed? Congress and the president. And it will show you exactly what they're doing. Consumers, me and you, we're both fighting the Fed. I mean, the Fed's trying to tamp down demand, but it's having virtually no success at doing that. A little bit on the edges, but not a whole lot. The stock market, that's been fighting the Fed for the last 3 years. And the labor market and unions are fighting the Fed. So let's take a look at each of those. So this is since January 1st of 2021. This doesn't include $4 trillion of COVID bills, okay? This is just since January of 2021. And what you see here is 4.8 trillion or $4.8 billion over the next 10 years of different programs that have been instituted since inflation started in January of 21 to continue to spend money. And this is basically demand pull inflation. All right. And what we've seen here is this is, of course, during the COVID year when we had the big budget deficit. We all accept that. People went home. They were told to go home. When you go home and you don't work, you don't pay taxes. Government spends a lot of money to try to offset the lost incomes of people, and you run a big budget deficit. Okay. But this is what we're looking at now. This year, it's about $1.5 trillion. The Congressional Budget Office suggests that because of all of this that we're looking at here, over the next 10 years, by 2031, or actually 2032, the U.S. government will be running a $2.8 trillion deficit. And this does not assume any recession during that period of time. So this is, all right. And here's what the problem is. All right, let's take a look. First, let's just look at the blue line. That's the US. The green line is North Carolina. So we're going along this kind of trend, right? And then we have COVID and everybody goes home and the GDP drops significantly, but it bounces right back up. It's not at the old level, but within what? By mid 21, it's back on the, like nothing ever happened, right? And the same thing for North Carolina. Like nothing ever happened by mid 21, yet we're still spending money trying to get out of COVID. That's part of the problem. So that's the government fighting the Fed. This is just another look at that. Here's the Fed balance sheet where it peaked out at 8.9 trillion during the 2021. They've since tapered or reduced the size of the balance sheet. That's a good thing. But the process is relatively slow compared to the ramping up that took place early on in 2020 and 2021. Maybe, here we go. And then personal consumption expenditures, same kind of problem here. We saw the dip, but this is you and me. All right. And it's like it never happened. And we're just driving on into the horizon, spending money left and right. So we're fighting the Fed as well. It's easy to put the finger, God, that's shame on you. Okay, what is it about glass houses and rocks and things? I don't know. It's an old proverb. And here's the Dow Jones Industrial Average through last month. And as you can see, it's grown almost doubled since the bottom of the COVID recession. So, you know, stock market's fighting the Fed. And why is it fighting the Fed? Profits are going up. Okay, everybody's beating expectations. 90% of the companies that report quarterly are beating expectations. All right. And labor unions, we've had a bunch of 23 contracts that came out. UPS, full-time driver salaries by 2028. Now, this includes benefits and overtimes, but on average, it's going to be $175,000 to drop that package off at your house. American Airlines pilots got 46% over 4 years. Delta got 34, and the UAW got 25% over 4 years. Okay, so labor unions and labor in general, and any of you who are running a business know about what labor costs are doing recently. So what will the Fed do? I think that's what everybody wants to kind of keep an eye on over the next few months, because if we were to do the clock back to probably late November, early December, everybody was predicting at least 3 rate decreases during 2024. So where are we now that we seem to have this stalled, potentially stalled inflation level at somewhere around 3.5%. All right, so just to remember, here's where we are now. That's the federal funds rate. That's the overall CPI. That's the core CPI. The question is, when you look at this thing, and when we're right here, is that a flattening? Has disinflation stalled? All right. Is this where we're going to be? Is the last 1.5% the hardest to get? That's question number one. Or is inflation getting ready to return? Okay, and that's the question that all the analysts are asking, and is on the Fed's mind, particularly as it goes into rate, because if it cuts rates, and either one of these is true, okay, then they made a mistake and they're going to have to go back in and do something very drastic, which could in fact lead to not a soft landing. All right. So recession uncertainty and economic headwinds. We've got consumer confidence to look at. We've got energy prices, look at inflation, wage catch up, because we're almost 4% behind, and the Fed operating deficit. So let's take a look at the Michigan's consumer sentiment. By the way, kind of the normal number here is 100. And you can see that we're below that. Consumers are better now than they were back in October of 21 when it dropped to 50. That's an index number. So we're considerably better off now, but we're not where we were back in 2015, 2016, 2017, when things were going along really, really well. So consumers are still a little leery of what the economy has in store for it. All right. Maybe. Yeah, here we go. Always worry about energy prices. You know, this $114 a barrel for West Texas Intermediate back in 2022 led to what? 4.5, $5 gasoline, if you remember that. All right. We're starting to come back up again. I don't know whether 85 is a problem. 90 starts to become a real problem, but we've seen gas prices in the last couple of months rise by about 35 cents nationally on average. That is a problem because it takes money out of pockets. Remember, when it comes to gasoline, you live where you live, you work where you work, and you own the car that you own. Those things are not much you can do about them in the short run. So you just pay the extra money. All right. This is something that probably a lot of you haven't seen before, but the Federal Reserve Bank in San Francisco on a quarterly basis takes a look at the 400 goods that are in the CPI and says, okay, what percentage of those have risen this much in prices? What percentage of those have declined during this quarter in prices? And so what we see here is the fraction of expenditures with price declines, okay? Prices going down. And as you can see, it was increasing until February 24 and March of 24. And we're starting to see it do what? Start to drop again, which means fewer of the 400 goods are experiencing price decreases. And what we've also seen, and again, these are small numbers going from 79 to 84. So, you know, a year ago, we were looking at 90% of the goods still showing price increases. Then we got down to 79, basically 80%. That's a pretty significant drop there. But over the last couple of months, we've seen it do what? Start to rise again. So rather than be looking at 80% rising and 20% falling, we're now looking at 85% rising and 15% roughly falling. So we've seen a shift, if you will, in the mix of the goods that are increasing prices versus decreasing prices. That's not a good sign, okay? That's not suggesting to me that we're just kind of leveling off in the last percent half is going to be hard. That says, maybe we're starting to trend back up again. All right. Country inflation. Where are we relative to the big economies in the world? So this is the current inflation rate year over year. And you can see if it's a red number, it's the worst. If it's a green number, it's the best. And so you can see that of all those big countries, Germany, UK, France, Canada, Italy, and even Japan. I put Japan down here, as you'll see in just a minute, kind of out of the loop with the rest of them. We have the highest inflation rate compared to the rest of the big economies in the world. You notice that I don't have China and Russia in here or India. Anybody want to take a guess why I don't have them in here? Data. It's not just that they don't have it, is you can't trust it. Okay. That's a good number. The central bank interest rate, you can see we have the highest rate. The UK has the lowest rate. Deficit to GDP, that's the current annual deficit compared to our GDP. We're at 6.3%. Only Italy is greater at 7.2%. Canada, look at that. Almost a balanced budget. They're just up there. That way. Okay. And debt to GDP, we're at 120%. Only Italy is 135. Now, Japan, as you can see, now you'll understand why I put it out there by itself. Debt to GDP is 263%. They are an outlier amongst countries. But as you can see, of these big economies here, the part of the 10 largest economies in the world, we're trending in the wrong direction here. But the big thing is we've got the highest inflation rate of any of these countries. All right. This is where it gets ugly. Okay. Silverback sitting there, the 800-pound gorilla that no one is talking about. And this is what's important in terms of understanding what the Fed's going to do. So since its inception in 1913, the Fed has been a steady moneymaker. They don't get a budget. They're not part of the federal budget. They don't get any money from the U.S. government to operate. They are essentially a quasi-governmental private agency. They're owned by the banks. So there are 12 districts. All right, so we're in the Richmond district. The Richmond Bank and the Charlotte branch are owned by the banks in this district. They're the shareholders. Okay, and it's got to make money, and it does that by the difference of its assets versus liabilities and the payout, but also in the services it provides banks, and they make money, and they earn a massive. They hand back nearly $1 trillion to the government in the last decade. So that's usually about $100 billion a year profit that they make that they turn back into the treasury, the money-making operation. However, Since the fall of 2020, when the federal funds rate moved high enough that the income from the Fed derived from bonds and services was less than they had to pay banks on their reserves that are held at the Fed, the rating continued to go. And basically, the Fed lost 58.8 billion in 22 and 114 trillion in 2023. And it's real simple. They have to pay a 25 basis point premium over the federal funds rate to reserves held at the Fed, held by the Fed for its member banks. So if Bank of America or Wells Fargo have deposits at the Fed has to pay them interest on those deposits, just like your bank has to pay you interest, okay, on your deposits. But they have to pay by law 25 basis points higher than the federal funds rate. So federal funds rate's 5.33% effectively right now. So they got to pay a little over 5.5%. Yet when you look at that $7.5 trillion balance sheet I showed you a little while ago, what's happening there is those are bonds that they bought back during COVID to suck up, if you will, government debt. Those bonds are paying 2.5%. All right, you do the math. I'm paying out almost a little over 5.5. I'm getting back 2 to 2.5%. Fed's balance sheet and their income statement looks a whole lot like Silicon Valley Bank did a year ago. I mean, that's exactly the situation SVB was in a year ago, right? They had sitting on a lot of long-term treasuries paying a very low rate, but they had to pay 5% to get money. Okay, and that's what's going on. So most analysts, or some analysts, are looking at a 200 billion range as the possibility hitting the market early next year. But this has all got to do with whether or not the Fed does what? Lowers the federal funds rate. There's nothing they can do about the bonds they hold, those assets. I mean, they got a 10-year treasury that's paying 2.3%. They have two choices. They can either continue to hold that bond and get 2.3%, or they can sell it at what? A discount and get, 92 cents on the dollar for the bond they hold, i.e. lose money. That's it. Those are their only two choices. So the only way out of this is to do what? Lower what they pay banks for the reserves held at the Fed, which means they have an incentive to do what? Lower their the federal funds rate. So anyway, so this is the meeting schedule going forward. We got one at the end. The next one is in June. I thought I changed that slide. Oh, well. We got one in June on the 11th and 12th, and then July, and then September. And what's the possibility of a rate cut during that period of time? Well, if they lower rates, they increase the likelihood of a soft landing. That's all good, right? They reduce the federal losses. That's good. But they increase the inflation risk going forward. If they keep rates at the current level, then what happens is they control inflation and maybe keep it from bouncing back up. They risk possible recession, but they increase federal losses. You do the calculus on this and say you're sitting on the FOMC board and you decide which of those you're going to do. And so what I'm suggesting to you is I think we'll see a rate cut this year, particularly if things don't get worse. If the next CPI that comes out is not worse than 3.5%, I think that we'll probably see a rate cut. All right. So let's take a look at 2024. So I guess I'm telling you, I'm thinking there's going to be a soft landing this year. And as a result of that, we're looking at an overall 3% growth rate for the North Carolina GDP. Big thing is we look at the sectors, almost all of them are going to sustain some degree of growth. But most importantly, even the manufacturing sectors are going to show growth during the year. And our retail trade is going to be up. And, typically a lot of the sectors that in fact have contributed to the growth in the past are going to continue to contribute to growth in the future. As far as jobs are concerned, it's going to be a little less than we had last year. We're down to 60,000 jobs, net jobs for 2024, about a 1.2% growth. And part of that is just simply the fact that it's hard to find people to work. I mean, companies are looking for people. We know there's a mismatch between supply and demand in the job market to the tune of almost 8 million jobs that go unfilled because we can't find workers. And as a result of that, I mean, that's going to hit home here as well. And it's not that we couldn't support more than 60,000 jobs. It's just as we simply don't have the people. Right. And then as far as unemployment rate is concerned, we think it's going to trend upward, probably hit about 4% by the end of this year. Just trickle upward ever so slightly during the year. Right now it's at 3.5%, but we think it's going to continue upward slightly. All right. So keys to watch going forward: Fed tapering, quantitative tightening, and interest rate policy. These are all things that are important. Keep your eye on energy prices. That becomes really important over time. And we start to see, if we start to see something approaching $100 a barrel, that's going to be problematic. Consumer confidence. Next week we get on that as at the end of this month. Monthly job growth, first Friday in the month, so that won't be until June and we see the next number. May inflation will come out June 12th. The next FOMC meeting is June 11th to the 12th. And then the second quarter GDP read will be in late July, last Thursday in July. Those are all keys to come out. And I think if those all look pretty good, we'll probably see a rate decrease in the summer. Probably the July, but certainly by the September meeting, we'll start to see maybe 125 basis point rate decrease. Key takeaways: exogenous shocks matter. Things that can happen, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's the tiff that we're having with China right now on trade relations. All of these things can come back and all of a sudden throw a wrench in everything. All right. And, you know, those are things that you can't predict, but they matter greatly in terms of changing the outlook. Fed policy matters. How resolved are they to continue to keep inflation from rising? And then finally, demand side versus supply side inflation. Can we get a shift away from the demand side inflation? I'm not sure we can, because I've seen nothing in the government to address deficit spending. And honestly, I've seen nothing in consumers to start to rein in and start to say, well, maybe there's going to be a rainy day. Finally, I suggest that there's a 50-50 chance of a return of inflation in 2024. We also have the wealth effect, which is compounding this problem. Think about it. Every day you look at your 401k and you say, well, I don't have to put any money in that, because guess what? It went up 3 or 4% in the last quarter, right? And so that wealth effect pushes you to continue to consume, which is why I think there may be a return of inflation. And then I think there's a very low chance of a recession in 2024. So overall, when we take a look at all of this, there are some exogenous things, both in terms of what happens in the rest of the world and with energy prices, and what Fed policy turns out to be during the rest of this year that could affect the outcome. But if everything is smooth, it's going to be, again, another pretty good growth year. The economy is going to do well, and we will probably see 1, maybe 2 rate decreases this year, which will keep the economy going and increase the likelihood of a soft landing. All right, with that great news, who says economics is a dismal science? Okay, I'll be happy to take any questions that you might have. All right, water time.
Start our Q&A session. We're going to alternate between the questions that is here in person and also online. And so so I know people have been submitting questions online. And so if you're here, you have a question, please raise your hand. And we have a staff member, lovely Andrea right there. We'll hand over the microphone. So I think we can start with a question here in person.
Hey, thank you. Always very informative.
Thank you.
Warren Wooten, City of Charlotte. There's a lot of commercial deals, real estate deals, that are not getting done right now because of interest rates.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that, at least in that market that I'm familiar with, that the music is stopping on some of these things. Are you seeing that? Your presentation didn't seem to indicate that. Would you agree with the assessment that I'm making anecdotally, because my information is anecdotal? And are you seeing that kind of behavior happening in other parts of our industries?
Okay, so that question about commercial real estate. Commercial real estate's a funny business in terms of trying to understand how it works. And we certainly are seeing a decrease in vacancy rates in the commercial sector, which is going to tamp down a new investment in that business. Okay, I think that's question number one. If we were to spin the clock back 6 months ago, everybody was concerned that 2024 would be a big commercial real estate bust because commercial real estate's not this 30-year mortgage business. It's constantly rolling over and being renegotiated. And as a result of that, every year you've got probably 10 to 15% of commercial real estate debt being rolled over and at new higher rates. And, you know, if you are in fact sitting on a property where people's leases have gone up, expired, and they're not paying rent again, then you don't have the income that lets you refinance that at the new improved higher rates. Okay. And I think that's really the heart of your question. And my sense is that while 6 months ago we were really concerned about that, that has turned out to be less of an issue going forward. Now, that doesn't mean that we haven't had local foreclosures here. We have. Okay, there's no question about that. But foreclosures on commercial properties are a lot less stressful and problematic than they are on residential. Because when you go back, you've seen the pictures, you go back into a residential foreclosure, everything of any value is already gone. They've ripped out the copper, they've ripped out the appliances, you know, they've trashed the place. And so you've got a house that maybe was worth 400,000, that's worth 300, but the damages, you know, makes it 200,000. So that doesn't happen with commercial. It still has value. So it comes down in value. You're going to have to lower the lease rates to get people to move in, but it still has a value. So even if it forecloses, all right, it still has some value, maybe 80%, 70%, but it doesn't go to zero like a lot of residential does. So it's not nearly as big a problem during that foreclosure period as residential property is. So I think that's helping us not see the big impact that we thought we were going to see 6 months ago, because that was the story 6 months ago. What's the story today, I think that's more problematic, is consumer credit. That's starting to become a problem, unsecured, particularly credit card debt. That's starting to become a problem. And we're starting to see a little bit of problem, partly because people weren't having to pay for 3 or 4 years, but we're also starting to see a problem in student debt as well. In terms of non-pays. So that is a bigger problem, I think, than the commercial, but I think commercial is legit. And again, it depends on cities. Okay. And so, you know, Charlotte's gotten hit pretty hard initially and has a pretty high vacancy rate, but throughout the country, and throughout the state, it doesn't appear to be a consistent problem. Don't know if I've helped you any. Okay, any other questions?
All right, so I'm going to go to a question submitted online, John. So I'm going to read out the question. So thinking about the long-term change in the job market, as you mentioned, over the 40-year, the pie charts, the increase in the decrease in manufacturing in particular. So how has this played out in the urban and rural areas for the state? And also, what is the kind of outlook?
That's a good question. And, you know, again, if you go back to the big loser in this from an employment standpoint has been manufacturing, gone from, you know, a third of the jobs to 10% of the jobs. And those tended to be not in the urban areas. Those tended to be in the rural areas. So kind of, or the smaller counties in the state. So kind of put that in the back of your head. On the other hand, we've seen the service employment go up dramatically. Okay, almost 3 times, from 15% to over 40%, okay, of jobs in the service area. And those tend to be more urban oriented, more metropolitan oriented. So, you know, that battle, when I first got here and started doing the forecast, there was a big concern about balanced growth between urban and rural areas. And there were lots of incentives for smaller counties, economically challenged counties, to incentives to bring business into those counties, particularly manufacturing. That no longer works. Why? There aren't that many manufacturing jobs. Okay. And so that divide between urban and rural, which, you know, for 50 or 60 years in this state has been a prime focus of trying to minimize that, trying to bring those two back together again, actually is going to get worse because of the shift in the way the economy is structured. So, yeah, I think that's a real problem. And as bad as things might seem in the urban areas, things are a lot worse in smaller communities around the state. There are a lot of really depressed areas that are not looking at any hope of recovery because there just aren't any manufacturing firms that are going to wind up going in there. And Service industries seem to be dominating in terms of job growth. We'll go back here, maybe not. Yeah, one more. There we go. The big blocks here: business and professional services, educational and health, hospitality and leisure, other services. Look at the size of them. That's where all the growth is in terms of jobs. Okay, so.
All right, we're going to go to a question in the audience. Oh, right here. Go ahead.
Thank you for the wonderful discussion. There's been increased talk, if you will, that if inflation does indeed remain this sticky at this 3-ish level, the Fed may change their policy target. And if being an election year and all, if that were to happen, does the Fed, regardless of short-term, excitement for equities and risk assets, does the Fed lose credibility in the long run if they were to say, 2% is just not reality anymore, and we're going to be more flexible around the 2.5% to 3% level?
I got like about 40 minutes of stories to help you to answer that question. And that is a great question. I love it. Okay. I suspect you're not the only one that's heard of the prospect of Fed effectively redefining what is an acceptable rate of inflation. Okay. But let me tell you a little story about where 2% came from. Okay. So I probably, like you, for all these years, I saw the 2%, I heard about the 2%. I'm like, yeah. That seems to be a good target. And I'm thinking, well, somebody like the National Bureau of Economic Research, that, not-profit economic research tank, if you will, they probably did a bunch of studies and kind of, worked the thing out and said, yeah, 2% is probably just about right. It gives you enough increase in the money supply and to allow growth to effectively take place without stymieing growth. But on the other hand, as we all know, inflation is the worst tax, most regressive tax of all. It minimizes the regressivity of the inflation tax. So I'm like, yeah, some people sat down, thought about this, and yeah. Well, as it turns out, that's absolutely not true. So we got to go back to the early 90s when New Zealand, of all places, was opening up their economy. They had been a very restrictive economy. They decided to try to start to take advantage of their location in the Indo-Pacific and become an international trading partner, open their economy up both to import goods, but also to export to the rest of Asia as Asian economies were picking up and becoming more wealthy. A result of that was, in the short term, they had a spat of inflation. Okay. And it got up to 6, 7, 8%. And it was pretty persistent. All right. And, New Zealand's like the United States. They got their Sunday talk shows, even though they're upside down. And, they've got their Sunday talk shows. And so the finance minister of New Zealand is in one of these Sunday talk shows. And a reporter is asking questions about, well, what are you doing to try to mitigate this? Has been going on for 18 months now, yada, 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 yada. And finally, she asks he's going along. And finally, she asks a simple question. Well, what is your target? What do you want to achieve? And he says 2%. And the rest is history. Europe picked up on it. And then the United States picked up on it. And it's become, so your question about what if we just redefine what's an acceptable rate of inflation is not impossible, because there's been no solid, hard, academic research on what is the right rate. What should you be targeting? That's where that 2% comes from. So, yeah. 3%? Yeah, we can live with that. Okay. So it's not far-fetched that could happen. Okay. Not far-fetched that could happen. I'm hoping it doesn't. My reading of Jerome Powell, he got a lot on the line in terms of his legacy. He's got a lot to prove, because for a year, he basically said, yeah, it's just transitory. Don't worry about it. So my sense is he might not be willing to go there. He might be willing to continue to try just a little longer. But at some point, that might become a reality. Sorry.
All right, I'm going to turn to a question from online. So some are saying that the second half of 2024, the economy in second half is going to be more positive than the first half. Do you agree? And what would that be?
Quite possibly that's true. One of the things that if you've done this long enough, you realize that every 4 years they have an election in this country. Have you picked up on that? And usually in election years, the economy gets juiced up. And as a result of that, you know, we've got that going for us. The Fed is, I don't know what they're going to do, but I suspect they're going to drop rates at least one time this year and maybe twice this year. If they do that, it could have an impact. I mean, think about this. They drop rates, let's say 50, maybe 75 basis points. All of a sudden, the 30-year mortgage drops from a little over 7 to maybe a little over 6. And housing market picks up. My commercial real estate becomes easier to refinance. So, I mean, it's quite possible depending on what the Fed does. If the Fed holds to its gun, I don't think, and keeps the rate until they start to see it start to dive toward 2% or get under, at least under 3% before they drop rates one time, then no, I don't think we'll see a pickup in the second half. But it's quite possible we could if the Fed gets a little, you know, we're losing money. We don't want to have a recession in an election year. And they basically pop rates down twice in the summer and maybe once in the early fall.
All right, now turn to a question from the audience here.
Can you speak to the stickiness of inflation within the housing market, how that complicates the Fed's job and ultimately how the economy can overcome that?
Yeah, this is a really long-term story. And what's going on right now is a couple of things. All right. So thing number one, we got to go back to 2008 when we had the financial crisis. A lot of it brought about by what? Housing. That was the big thing. And as a result of that, lots of regulations were passed that made it very, very difficult for financial institutions, commercial banks, to issue construction loans like they used to. And as a result of that, lots of small builders just don't exist anymore. So what we have essentially is the big builders. So we don't have people going in and building a dozen houses. We have people going in and building 300-400 house operations. And we just have had a dearth of supply in new housing over the last 15 years, which has led to what's going on right now with the price of housing. On top of that, I don't know whether anybody picked up on this. In the last 3.5 years or so, we've increased the population in this country, the physical people here, by somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 to 9 million people in terms of immigrants. Okay. They need some place to live, but yet we're not building new product. Well, when you don't build new product, whether it's houses or apartment buildings, what happens to prices? You all took my principles class, right? Yeah. Supply curve moves back. What happens to price? It goes up. And so that's really what's generating this. This is a supply side problem in terms of new construction, both the single family, multifamily, that really isn't meeting the needs of the economy. Part of it is financial regulations, but also part of it's local regulation. Local regulation has made it harder and more expensive to build properties. So I don't see that changing anytime soon. I think it's going to become increasingly harder and more expensive to own to shelter costs. And one last little thing, we've seen this analysts talking about how the sticky shelter component of the CPI has been causing problems. Well, yeah, it's causing problems. It's kind of strange the way they do that, and we don't have time to explain it. But it's got to do with the fact that not all housing gets repriced every month. There's a lag, a 12-month lag. So when prices go up, not everybody in that housing market gets a price increase. It may take a year or two before their lease comes up and they get repriced. That's the short of it. But anyway, that's not going away anytime soon. Not when you have such an increase in the demand side for housing in this country, and you still have tamps on the supply side. It's just with them supply and demand curves. Remember that? Guy used to get up there and move them around, and price went up. So that's what's going on here. It's just simply supply and demand. I'm sorry. Dolly?
All right, so let's turn to a question submitted online. So North Carolina labor market is projected to shift toward occupation with higher education requirements, maybe toward more technical. Would this create challenges or just opportunity for the state economy?
Yeah, I'm not sure it creates a lot of challenges. We've been fortunate in this state in that we're a net in-migration state. And I just got through telling you that's a problem when it comes to housing, but it's a positive when it comes to businesses operating and being able to get talent. It's easy to get people to move here from other parts of the country. It's not hard at all. Quality of life here is good. Cost of living here is good. Job opportunities are good. Just the weather's great. Just a number of things that make it easy for this state to attract people. I mean, I think since the census, we've gone up. I could be wrong on this. I could be 100,000 off, but either 300,000 or 400,000 population increase just in the last 4 years. So it's 3.5 years since the census. And that gives you an idea of, makes it easier for our businesses to get labor. Okay. So I don't really think it's going to be a big problem. Plus, we're fortunate, plug for the university system in North Carolina and the community college system in North Carolina. We have one of the best community college systems in the country, period. Both from a price standpoint and from an access standpoint. What do we got? 60 some community colleges in the state. And so as a result of that, our ability to satisfy those educational needs is a lot better than a lot of other states, both in terms of access and in terms of price. So I don't see that as being a big problem for us. In fact, I see it as being a benefit for us being able to quickly and agility wise handle the transition that we're seeing.
Great. Now we can turn to a question in the audience. I think we have a couple here.
Yeah, we'll take, I think we got a
Yeah,
few minutes.
probably like a couple more.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Thank you. I noticed you had the unemployment rate creeping up a little bit here.
Yeah.
You attribute that to layoffs or increased participation, or possibly, I don't know if it factors in retirement, peak 65 retirement?
More to the fact that I think we've reached the peak, if you will, of increasing labor force participation rate. But I think we're rising it, but we haven't reached the peak yet of increased labor force participation rate. So more people are going to be coming into this very strong labor market. And secondly, we have a lot of people, as I just mentioned, coming into the state, increasing the size of the labor force. And so I think the in-migration issue right now is a little bit stronger than the internal growth of companies. So I think that those two things are going to lead it's just a ratio. And we're going to see, I don't think that we're going to see a big change, but it varies. I mean, it's a 0.5% increase from where we are now. That's not a big change over a year, but I think that it's likely to creep up a little bit. Plus, again, if the Fed doesn't, it could get where it doesn't drop rates, it could get even higher than 4%. But my guess is it'll just creep up to 4%. Yep.
Okay, so we can go to another question. I think there was a
One more
question,
here, yeah.
right? One more. Yes.
Supposed to be out of here, right? Yeah,
Thanks.
right here.
Yeah, right there. Yeah.
I was a little surprised by the agriculture numbers for North Carolina, that it was at a decrease last year.
Oh.
And then it wasn't even on the list for this year. Is that something that we're working on, or is there a reason for that?
Well, first of all, we could have stories to go forever on this. I don't know how many people remember this, but back, right after World War II, I think the population of mules in the state was higher than people. Because that's who pulled the plows. No, never mind. Okay. At one point in time, agriculture was a big part of this state's economy, and it is not anymore. I mean, if you drive up Interstate 85, if you did that 50 years ago or 40 years ago, you would see fields. You don't see a field. You see warehouses, you see buildings. It just the growth of population and the change in it, but also this is not the greatest state in terms of agricultural production. We still have some farms out in the eastern part of the state, but in the central part and even the western part, I mean, the biggest crop we have right now is Christmas trees. You know, that's the biggest moneymaker in terms of the agricultural sector is Christmas trees. Sorry about that. Yeah. It's not your granddad's North Carolina. Okay. Remember, 20% of the economy is what? Those big tall buildings out downtown here and in Winston and in Raleigh, et cetera. It's the finance, insurance, and real estate industry. That's the big one. And, 50 years ago, it was barely anything. Even 40 years ago, it was 10% of the economy. Now it's 20%. And that's been one of the big growers. Okay. All right. Well, I think.
Yeah, I think, is there any last question from the audience?
One more.
Yeah.
Oh,
All right, we
one
have one
more.
more
All right,
right
one
there.
more,
We'll
and then
take this final question.
Yeah.
As it relates to the stickiness of consumer driven demand on inflation, and we've talked about the checks from the government, right? Those have gone away, people racking up more credit card debt. But how about the demographic component where you have, pretty much nearly all the boomers are shifting in or already have shifted into retirement. They were traditionally, diligent savers, right? And a lot of them had your traditional defined benefit plans. They couldn't even draw on their retirement savings early, right? So how tall of a task is it for the Fed to fight that demographic challenge where suddenly you're going to have a couple decades of this spending that, they're going to be doing?
I'm going to make a corny comment on that. Okay. Most boomers are now looking at the situation where they're not worried about spending it because it's not their money. It's their kids' money. Right. And so, you're right about that. Boomers are they were born between 46 and 64. So even the trailing edge of those boomers are, in their retirement years. They were great savers on two counts. One is they did well saving during that period of time, whether they have a defined plan or a defined contribution plan or a defined benefit plan. Both of those things have turned out to do very, very well. But more importantly, the boomers inherited from their parents significant amounts of money as well. So they're the most affluent retired generation. I'm sorry, I get a little carried away here. But the Great Society back in 64 and 65 and Johnson's War on Poverty, and he wanted to change the number of people that were under the poverty threshold, which was about 15% then. The bulk of those were made up of seniors. That's not true today. Virtually no seniors are in poverty. There's still some, but most aren't. Partly because of what Johnson did, but also partly because, or mostly because, that generation that are now seniors were better savers and had more options for savings. Previous generations didn't have 401ks. Okay. Previous generations didn't have IRAs, didn't have Roth IRAs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And those all came on board during that generation. And so, so back to the heart of your question, is the Fed having a hard time fighting? Yeah, they are. That is a big problem. I trash government. I put a big number up there, but consumers are just as guilty of fighting the Fed as the federal government is, Congress and the president. Just as guilty. And when you think about it, and you're in your 60s or early 70s, which most boomers are now, how many more years do they have? And COVID created this experience. I'm going to get those experiences out. I got postponed a year or a year and a half, depending, and I don't give a damn. I'm just going to do it. And that makes the Fed's job even harder and goes back to that question of maybe they'd be willing to accept 3%. So, all right, I want to thank you all for your attendance.
Thank you.
And I
Give a big round of applause to John.
Thank you. I think we're doing this again in September.
Yes, we are.
Okay.
Yes,
And so by then we should know whether the Fed has done much of anything. All right. Thank you very much.
All
You have a
right.
good afternoon.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming.